There is a certain hush to the sea before dawn. That wide, pale silence when the horizon and the sky blur into one another. And even the wind seems to wait. In that hour between darkness and day, the great carrier Enterprise stirred. Her decks glistened with salt, her steel plates still damp from the night air. Below, the heartbeat of turbines thudded like a steady drum, a pulse that would soon echo across half the world. She was young then, barely 4 years old. Born in a time when America still dreamed of peace. Launched in 1936, she had been built not for glory but for readiness. A floating airfield meant to reach beyond the limits of land. At 809 feet long and displacing more than 20,000 tons. She was both fortress and feather. Massive enough to carry 90 planes, yet nimble enough to slice through the Pacific at 30 knots. Sailors called her the Big E. The name began as shorthand, but soon it became something affectionate, almost superstitious, a charm against the vast uncertainty of the sea. When war came, it did not knock gently. The first whisper reached her by radio on December 7, 1941. As she steamed back toward Pearl Harbor from a routine delivery run to Wake Island, the voice crackled over the headset. Urgent, disbelieving, thin as a thread across thousands of miles. Air raid on Pearl Harbor. This is not a drill. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then the ship's captain, George D. Murray, turned toward the horizon and ordered full speed ahead. By the time Enterprise reached Oahu, the harbor still smoked. Battleships lay half submerged, their masts jutting from the water like the bones of dead whales. Oil fires shimmered across the surface, and the air smelled of burnt paint and salt. It was there, among the ruin, that the crew of Enterprise understood. Their quiet peacetime voyage had become something else entirely. The Pacific was no longer an ocean of trade and tide. It was a battlefield. In those first uncertain weeks, America's carriers were suddenly its only claws. The proud battle fleet had been gutted at Pearl, and the task of striking back fell to the flat tops. Enterprise, Lexington, Saratoga, Yorktown. Enterprise led the way. On the last day of 1941, she launched her first wartime strike against Japanese outposts in the Marshall Islands. The pilots, still raw with anger and disbelief, flew with the kind of focus born of vengeance. A young lieutenant later wrote in his log, "The sea looked so blue that morning, and I remember thinking, this will be the last beautiful thing I see today." From that point on, the carrier became a phantom. She appeared suddenly where the enemy least expected, struck, and vanished again into the haze. The Japanese began calling her the Grey Ghost, for they believed she had been sunk, several times, in fact. Yet she kept returning, impossible to kill. Her early battles read now like chapters in a fever dream. In April 1942, her planes escorted Jimmy Doolittle's bombers on their daring raid over Tokyo. A symbolic strike that proved Japan itself was not untouchable. A month later came the Coral Sea. And then, most fatefully, the Battle of Midway. At Midway, the Pacific itself seemed to hold its breath. The Japanese fleet, vast, confident, unbroken, steamed toward the tiny atoll that lay at the heart of the ocean. There, on June 4th, Enterprise joined Yorktown and Hornet in what would become the turning point of the war. From her deck, bombers roared into the morning light, their engines beating against the wind. They climbed high, searching the endless horizon for a glint of sunlight on steel, the telltale reflection of carriers. And then they found them. 3 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, burned before noon. Enterprise's dive bombers had struck with surgical precision, plunging through clouds and flak into walls of fire. One pilot, Lieutenant Richard Best, recalled afterward the eerie calm of the moment just before impact. The world went silent, And then the carrier below me bloomed open like a flower of flame. When the smoke cleared, the Imperial Japanese Navy had lost the heart of its offensive power. Midway had changed everything. And Enterprise had been at its center. But glory comes at a price. The next months were a blur of exhaustion. Guadalcanal, Santa Cruz, the Solomons. The Pacific sun burned men's skin to leather. The nights smelled of fuel and fear. At Santa Cruz in October 1942, enemy bombers found her. A 500-pound bomb tore through her decks, exploding near the island's superstructure. Men were thrown into the air like rag dolls. Fire raced along the hangar, licking at the stacked planes. For hours, the crew fought to keep her alive. Water mains burst, ammunition cooked off. And still the sailors formed bucket lines, passing foam and grit with bare hands. By midnight, the fires were out. A petty officer later wrote in a letter home, "The ship felt alive under our feet. As if she wanted to live as badly as we did." Repairs were made at Pearl Harbor. And within weeks, impossibly, she was back at sea. Once again, the enemy reported her sunk. Once again, the gray ghost returned. What fascinates me, sitting here decades later with these old reports spread before the firelight, is not the statistics, the tonnage, the sorties, the kills, but the texture of the ship's endurance. There is a rhythm to her history, a pulse that mirrors the heartbeat of the men who served aboard her. They were farm boys, machinists, teachers, ballplayers, drawn from every corner of America and welded together by salt and fear. On quiet nights, they listened to phonograph records on the mess deck, the scratchy voice of Bing Crosby drifting through the corridors. They wrote letters on stationery that smelled faintly of oil and tobacco. They hung photographs of girls from home in their lockers, and whispered prayers to the steel walls that surrounded them. And through it all, Enterprise carried them. Steady, implacable, a world unto herself. When she returned to Pearl after Midway, the battered hull was greeted not by trumpets, but by silence. The sailors stood along her rails, staring at the black smoke still rising from the shipyard's ruins. One young seaman turned to another and murmured, "It feels like the sea is keeping score." Perhaps it was. For every victory came a name added to the list of the lost. The Pacific had its own ledger, and it balanced slowly, wave by wave. As I read the logs tonight, the faded ink, the steady handwriting of men who would never see old age, I realized that Enterprise was more than a machine. She was memory given shape. A vessel built to carry not just aircraft, but courage. When sailors spoke of her later, they used words you don't usually hear about steel. They said she lived, that she endured, that she remembered. By the end of 1942, she was the only operational U.S. carrier left in the Pacific. Every other had been sunk, crippled, or withdrawn. The Japanese Navy thought the seas finally theirs. But from the mist near Guadalcanal, the gray ghost reappeared. Battered, patched, defiant. A Japanese radio operator, intercepting her transmissions, reportedly muttered, "That cursed ship again." And so she fought on. Through 1943, through Tarawa, the Marshalls, the Marianas. Her deck stained with oil, her planes roaring like storm winds. The men aboard her stopped counting battles. They only counted sunrises. And somewhere, between those sunrises, the ship herself seemed to grow old. Rust crept along the seams. Paint flaked beneath the salt. But she pressed forward tireless. The Pacific was vast. But so was her resolve. And so, as the Big E sails deeper into the war, we will follow her. Through typhoon and battle. Through loss and triumph. Into the heart of the Pacific where her legend was truly forged. In the next section, we'll journey with her to the Battle of the Philippine Sea, where the skies would fill with hundreds of aircraft, and the gray ghost would once again prove that even steel can have a soul. Dawn over the Pacific could play tricks on a man's mind. The horizon often seemed to bend upward, as if the world were holding its breath. The sky wore a pearl-gray veil, the ocean, a heaving mirror. And there, framed between them, rose the flat silhouette of the USS Enterprise, still and immense, a cathedral of steel that floated, humming softly like a living thing. When I first read the ship's early logbooks, I noticed how matter-of-fact the language was. Began fueling operations 0645. Commenced gunnery practice 1100. Yet hidden between those bureaucratic lines lies a strange serenity. The Enterprise was not merely preparing for battle, she was learning to breathe, to sense the pulse of war moving toward her. She had been commissioned in 1938, christened by Lully Swanson, wife of the Secretary of the Navy. Even the champagne bottle shattered against her bow with an echo that some sailors swore lingered in the metal for days. By the time she sailed to Pearl Harbor in 1940, she had already gathered a small family: pilots, deckhands, cooks, signalmen, each with a private ritual. A few of them whispered to her before dawn watch. Others touched the railing 3 times before walking on deck. Superstition is just faith in disguise, and aboard the Enterprise faith was as common as salt. Then came the 7th of December, 1941. The ship had been at sea, ferrying planes to Wake Island. She returned to find Pearl Harbor wounded, columns of smoke rising like black reeds, the air stinking of oil and burned paint. God help the men still inside, a boatswain wrote that morning. The Enterprise sailed in circles outside the harbor, half expecting Japanese bombers to descend on her next. But none came. The Big E had survived by a quirk of timing, and fate had quietly chosen her for something larger. In the weeks that followed, the crew moved with a kind of reverent urgency. They painted over scorch marks, replaced torn netting, and drilled until the motions of launching planes were smoother than breath itself. Commander William Halsey, a man with eyes like blue sparks, addressed the men from the bridge. "You are now the spearhead of this Navy," he told them. "We've been bloodied, but we'll give better than we got." The Enterprise was already famous among carrier crews for her uncanny luck, how enemy torpedoes seemed to pass just a few yards short, how she always arrived where she was needed an hour ahead of disaster. Sailors called it the Enterprise Ghost. No one mocked the superstition. After Pearl Harbor, miracles were simply listed as coordinates. Through the early months of 1942, the Big E became the restless arm of a wounded nation. Her planes struck the Marshalls and Gilberts, little chains of islands that glowed like embers on the map. The pilots returned spattered with salt and exhilaration, some so young they still carried school photographs in their flight jackets. They learned to sleep under the rhythmic thunder of engines, to eat sandwiches cold, to write letters by the red glow of battle lanterns. The diary of Ensign James Landers, found years later in a trunk, reads, "You can't imagine how large the ocean feels until you are a tiny piece of it. But at night, when we launch into the dark, the deck lights of the Enterprise look like home. She's more than a ship. She's a heartbeat you can hear through your boots." By April, the Enterprise escorted the Hornet on a mission so secret even most of her crew didn't know its purpose: to launch B-25 bombers toward Tokyo, the Doolittle raid. The sea was gray and sullen, the wind thick with mist. When the bombers roared off the Hornet's deck, men aboard the Enterprise lined her rails, silent. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, American engines were pointed at Japan. Hope, fragile but bright, began to glow again beneath the ship's decks. But war's rhythm soon darkened. The Battle of Midway came like a thunderclap. In June 1942, the Enterprise sailed into history. Planes lifted from her deck like silver seeds, vanishing into clouds toward the Japanese fleet. Hours later, smoke on the horizon told the tale. 4 enemy carriers burning, one of them the Akagi. The price was dear. Dozens of her pilots never returned. The ocean swallowed them quietly, and yet their absence hummed through the hull for years. "We lost friends," one mechanic recalled, "but saved the Pacific." Midway turned the Enterprise into legend. Reporters wrote of her as if she were a single sentient being. Her crew, exhausted and salt-stung, came to believe it too. Even in port, sailors from other ships would glance at her with a kind of awe, murmuring, "That's the Big E." Children in San Francisco sent her mail addressed simply to the luckiest ship in the world. Yet for all the headlines, the life aboard her remained one of repetition and waiting. The scent of aviation fuel clung to every shirt. Deckhands scraped rust until their knuckles bled. At night, the faint glow of cigarettes made constellations across the hangar deck. Each man carried his own ghosts, letters from home, promises to sweethearts, the quiet question of whether he would see another sunrise. It is easy, when reading about naval warfare, to get lost in tonnage and tactics. But what moves me most are the small details. The quartermaster who brewed coffee from rainwater when supplies ran low, the gunner who carved tiny birds from shell casings, the chaplain who whispered psalms over the sea. These are the stitches that held the vast tapestry of war together. By late 1942, the Enterprise had been hit more than once. Bombs tore open her decks during the Battle of the Eastern Solomons. Fires raged, smoke billowed. Yet every time, the damage control teams moved with the patience of monks. "She will not sink," one sailor vowed, pressing a hand to the warm steel. And she never did. The Pacific War was a war of distances, thousands of miles of shifting tides, where one ship could feel utterly alone. Still, the Enterprise always seemed to arrive where courage was needed most. At Santa Cruz, at Guadalcanal, at the Philippine Sea, each battle chipped at her hull but polished her legend. Her logbooks became a litany of endurance. By the winter of 1943, she had earned a nickname among the Japanese: the Grey Ghost. Radio intercepts captured their disbelief. How could this carrier, supposedly sunk twice, appear again and again? The myth spread faster than her wake. As I sit by my fire now, the logs popping softly, I picture her in that vast expanse of ocean, night operations in moonlight, the deck crew moving like shadows, the red wands of the signal officers carving silent paths in the dark. Somewhere below, in the dim light of the ready room, young men waited for dawn and their next sortie. One might have written in his pocket notebook, "The sea feels endless, but so does our duty." The Enterprise had, by then, become more than a weapon. She was a promise that even amid wreckage and loss, something steadfast could remain afloat. And as 1943 drew to a close, a new horizon beckoned. The Allies were preparing to advance, to push across island after island toward Japan itself. The Enterprise, scarred and seasoned, would lead that push once more. Ahead lay the Marianas, the Philippines, and the storm of Leyte Gulf, the last great test of the Pacific's Grey Ghost. Segue into Section 3. But destiny, like the tide, has a way of returning. As 1944 dawned over the restless Pacific, the Enterprise would again find herself at the heart of the storm, where courage and exhaustion met beneath the roar of the endless sea. The year 1944 began with a faint hum of inevitability. By then, the Enterprise had become a veteran of the Pacific, her once glossy decks dulled by salt and sun, her sides tattooed with the pale scars of repair plates. The men who walked her corridors did so with the quiet gait of old sailors, efficient, unhurried, half superstitious. The ship had lived through things no vessel was meant to endure, and so had they. In the still mornings before dawn flight operations, there was a sound unlike any other, the low, thrumming heartbeat of her engines reverberating through the steel. It reminded some men of a mother's pulse, steady, comforting, endless. To stand upon her deck in that hour was to feel part of something ancient and patient, something vast and alive. The sea was black glass, the sky a dark dome stippled with stars. Somewhere in that enormous stillness, war waited, crouched beyond the horizon. By early spring, the Enterprise sailed once again under Admiral Raymond Spruance's Fifth Fleet. Her mission, to help secure the Marshall Islands. The strategic goal was simple: build stepping stones toward Japan. But to the men aboard, it felt like traversing infinity, island by island, while the ocean swallowed everything it could. Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay, one of the senior aviators, wrote to his wife, "There are moments when the sea looks too calm, too forgiving. You forget it's a graveyard. The ship moves like a great animal that knows something we don't. She keeps her silence, and we trust her." The raids on Kwajalein and Eniwetok came swiftly, almost clinically. Planes launched in waves, their propellers carving pale halos in the morning mist. The deckhands moved with an elegance born of exhaustion, fueling, arming, signaling, launching. Each action was muscle memory. And every time the planes returned, they brought with them fragments of distant islands, volcanic dust, the scent of burnt palm, sometimes nothing at all. To an outside observer, it might have seemed mechanical, impersonal. But within the Enterprise's steel body pulsed the humanity of 2,000 men, each carrying private fears like folded paper in their pockets. In the mess, conversations drifted between jokes and silences. Someone might hum a half-remembered tune from home. "Don't sit under the apple tree," while another quietly cleaned his sidearm. On calmer nights, they gathered near the fantail, watching the phosphorescent wake stretch behind them like a trail of fallen stars. The chaplain often joined them, pipe in hand, murmuring that God's handwriting looks a lot like moonlight on water. But war never stayed quiet for long. In June came the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the largest carrier duel in history. They called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The Enterprise, once again in the vanguard, launched her Hellcats into a sky thick with enemy aircraft. The roar was indescribable, a living wind of engines, gunfire, and courage. From the deck, the men could see tiny dots spiraling in the heavens, tracer fire blooming like orange threads in the blue. One Japanese dive bomber fell so close that the shockwave rattled every rib of the ship. Fragments rained down, burning briefly before the sea consumed them. A gunner named Robert, Tiny, Callahan later wrote in his notebook, "When the planes came at us, I stopped thinking about dying. You can't think at all. You just move, breathe, fire, reload. Then when it's over, your hands are shaking and you realize you've been alive the whole time, alive in a way that hurts." By dusk, the sky was empty again. Hundreds of enemy planes had been destroyed. The Big E's gunners had held fast, and her pilots had returned with victory etched into their eyes. Yet triumph aboard a warship was always quiet, almost embarrassed. The men didn't cheer. They just cleaned their weapons, patched the holes, and waited for morning. As historian Samuel Eliot Morison later wrote, "The Enterprise carried her luck like a medal the ocean could never tarnish." But those who lived aboard her knew it wasn't luck at all. It was endurance, a kind of collective stubbornness that kept them upright long after fear had drained away. Still, the strain was visible. The old carrier groaned in high seas, her decks creaking like the bones of an elder warrior. Each repair left another scar. Yet she pressed on, serving in the Philippines campaign, launching raids on Leyte, and surviving kamikaze attacks that might have crippled a younger ship. One winter morning, December 1944, a kamikaze aircraft dove out of a break in the clouds. The sirens screamed, that thin, rising wail that turns marrow to ice. Men dove for cover, anti-aircraft guns blazed. The plane struck the water just yards off the bow, the explosion shattering windows on the bridge. For hours afterward, the smell of burnt aviation fuel clung to every surface. When night fell, the crew gathered in silence on the flight deck. One sailor began to whistle softly. "I'll be seeing you." The tune drifted across the sea, haunting and fragile. The Big E had survived again. As the war dragged into its final year, the Enterprise became both legend and ghost. She was the most decorated ship in the U.S. Navy, bearing 20 battle stars and the gratitude of a weary fleet. But she was also tired, her steel fatigued, her decks patched, her men frayed. I often think of that time as her twilight. Like an old soldier, she had earned her rest, yet duty kept calling her name. Even the ocean seemed to respect her, its waves breaking gently along her sides as if in deference. Then came April 1945, Okinawa. The last and most brutal of the Pacific campaigns. The Big E was there again, her decks lined with planes, her men ready though hollow-eyed. Kamikazes came daily now, flinging themselves at anything that moved. On May 14th, one finally struck home. The plane smashed into the flight deck near the forward elevator, its bomb detonating deep within the hull. Fire erupted instantly. Smoke poured skyward, black and churning. For 3 hours, the crew fought not only flames but despair. But even then, the Big E would not sink. Chief Petty Officer William McKeever recalled. It felt like she refused to die. We were fighting not for ourselves anymore, but for her. You could feel her heartbeat slow, then steady again. She was alive. We all knew it. The Enterprise limped home after Okinawa. Her decks were torn open, her hangars blackened. She would never return to combat. Yet when she entered Pearl Harbor for the final time, every ship in port dipped its colors. Even the harbor tugboats sounded their horns in salute. To the men who watched her glide in, battered but unbroken, it was like seeing an old friend step off a battlefield, wounded, yes, but undefeated. And as I turn through the faded pages of her decommissioning records, I find myself pausing often. The paper smells faintly of dust and salt, as if it remembers the sea. The words are plain. Service concluded, February 1947. But behind those words lies an echo, the hum of engines, the crackle of radios, the whispered prayers of 2,000 souls who once called her home. In those last entries, there's no mention of glory, only gratitude. She carried us farther than we thought we could go, one sailor wrote. And maybe that's all a ship, or a man, can ever do. The Enterprise would not see the nuclear age. She was scrapped in 1958, piece by piece, her metal melted down into the bones of a new world. But somewhere out there, in the silence of the Pacific night, I like to imagine her spirit still moving, a shadow on the waves, a guardian of memory. Her legend, after all, was never about destruction. It was about endurance. The kind that keeps a flame lit even when the wind howls through the rigging. And so, the Big E passed into history. Yet her story does not end there. Because history, much like the ocean, never truly rests, it only circles back, whispering to those willing to listen. And as the Pacific fell quiet and the guns grew cold, the men who served aboard her carried her memory home, in dreams, in scars, in the strange stillness that comes after thunder. But for many, peace would prove its own kind of battle. The war ended not with a bang aboard the Enterprise, but with a silence so deep it unsettled the men who had lived too long by noise. For years, they had known nothing but the hum of engines, the shriek of sirens, the cough of guns. Silence was foreign, an unfamiliar guest aboard a ship that had once carried the thunder of a nation's fury. When word came of Japan's surrender in August 1945, the announcement echoed across the deck like a rumor too good to believe. Men stood where they were, tools in hand, eyes distant. Some laughed too loudly. Others wept quietly into oil-stained sleeves. One gunner wrote in his log that day, "No cheers. Just breathing. It feels strange to breathe without waiting for the next alarm." The Pacific was vast and blue and heartbreakingly calm. For the first time in years, no enemy planes dotted the horizon. No columns of smoke marred the sky. The ship moved through still waters as though unsure of her purpose. The Big E was tired, scarred, patched, and weary. Her flight deck bore the blackened marks of fire, and the ghosts of names stenciled hastily on lockers. Every corner of her hull told a story, a bullet hole left unpatched near the starboard gun, initials carved into a bulkhead during a long watch, a scrap of faded pin-up paper fluttering near a vent. The men were tired too. They moved slowly, as if afraid to wake something sleeping beneath the waves. They cleaned their guns, even though there was no longer anything to shoot. They checked and rechecked aircraft that would never fly another mission. Habit was hard to kill. Somewhere below deck, the radio played softly, Bing Crosby, singing, "I'll be home for Christmas." The sound drifted through corridors still scented faintly of smoke and oil. For the first time, the song didn't sound like a promise. It sounded like a memory already fading. They sailed homeward across the Pacific, the same sea that had once swallowed their friends and dreams. The sun was gentle now, almost kind. Flying fish skittered beside the hull. Men leaned over the rails, squinting toward a horizon that finally promised peace. When they reached Pearl Harbor, the harbor was alive with ships and noise. Tugboats honked, flags rippled in the breeze, and bands played on the docks. But aboard the Enterprise, the celebration felt muted, introspective. The men had learned too well that joy and grief often share the same space. Captain Osborne Hardison, the Big E's commanding officer at the time, addressed the crew over the intercom. "We've done our duty and more. The Enterprise will rest now. And so will we. But let it be known, she never once failed this country." The men stood in silence, caps held against their chests. The wind fluttered through the signal flags like a sigh. In the months that followed, the ship's company began to disband. Some went home to farms, others to factories or schools. A few stayed in the Navy, unable to imagine a life away from the sea. But all carried with them the hum of the Big E's engines, a sound that seemed to echo faintly even in their sleep. Letters from that period tell of strange dreams. Pilots wrote of waking suddenly, convinced they were still in the cockpit. Deckhands described hearing the clatter of arrestor cables in the stillness of their bedrooms. Wives learned to wake gently, touching their husbands' shoulders before speaking, lest a sudden sound summon back a memory too vivid. And then there were the silences. The veterans spoke of her, the ship, in the same tone others might reserve for a person. They said she had moods, that she could sense danger, that her luck had been real. One sailor, writing to his grandson decades later, put it simply: "The Enterprise was our mother, our church, and our ghost. She carried us through hell and back, and we never thanked her properly." When the Navy decommissioned her in 1947, the ceremony was small but dignified. A gray sky hung low over the harbor. Rain tapped gently on the deck. As the flag was lowered for the final time, a single bugle played. Taps. Some of the old crew stood at attention. Others could not bear to watch. I imagined the ship in that moment, emptying of life, her compartments echoing with footsteps that would soon fade. The scent of paint and salt lingered, mingling with the faint hum of generators winding down. The lights dimmed. The Big E slept. For years she sat moored quietly, waiting for a decision about her fate. There were petitions to preserve her as a museum, but post-war America was tired of reminders. New wars brewed in politics and ideologies, and old relics seemed too heavy to carry forward. By the 1950s, her fate was sealed. She would be scrapped, dismantled piece by piece, her steel melted down, her soul dispersed into the bones of a new age. It's easy, reading those lines in a naval archive, to feel a pang of injustice. How could something that had done so much simply vanish? But perhaps that's how legends survive, by becoming intangible, slipping quietly into the realm of memory where no rust can reach. Today, only fragments remain, a ship's bell, a nameplate, a few sections of armor preserved in museums. And yet, ask any naval historian, and they'll tell you, the Enterprise never truly died. Her legacy lived on through her namesakes, through the spirit of every carrier that followed her into the waves. I once visited one of her surviving crewmen, decades after the war. His home was small, neat, with photographs on every wall, men in flight jackets, faces smudged with oil and youth. He sat in a worn armchair, his hands trembling slightly as he lifted a faded cap embroidered with USS Enterprise CV-6. "She was alive, you know," he said, staring past me, as though looking out across an invisible sea. "When we were scared, she'd creak, just a little. Like she was talking back. When the wind blew through her antennas, it sounded like a hymn. We trusted her. And she trusted us." He fell silent for a long time, the only sound the ticking of a clock. Then he smiled faintly. "Every night, I still hear the engines. And it helps me sleep." That line stayed with me. Because history isn't just about battles or medals, it's about echoes. The things that remain when the guns go quiet. And in that sense, the Enterprise still sails. Not on any ocean we can chart, but in the gentle drift of remembrance. The way her name surfaces in old letters, the way veterans pause when they speak of her, as if invoking an old friend's spirit. If you listen closely enough, perhaps on some quiet night when the wind smells faintly of salt, you might hear her too, the low hum of engines far off in time, the whisper of waves against her hull. The Big E was not just the deadliest warship of the Pacific. She was the beating heart of a generation, one that learned, through fire and loss, what endurance truly means.
And though her decks have long since been broken apart, her spirit endures wherever men look to the horizon and remember. But legends do not end with silence. They ripple outward, shaping what follows. As the Cold War dawned and a new enterprise rose from the shipyards, the name once again prepared to sail into history, carrying with it the ghost of its mighty ancestor. Names, like ships, carry weight. Some slip quietly into history unremembered, while others refuse to fade. Enterprise was one of the latter, a word that seemed to hum with its own electricity, echoing through the steel corridors of time. When the old USS Enterprise CV-6 was scrapped in 1958, a quiet sadness spread among those who had served her. They spoke of her dismantling as one might speak of a burial. Newspapers noted the event in small columns, a few lines among headlines about the Cold War and atomic tests. But to her crew, the Big E was not gone, she had merely gone silent, waiting beneath the surface of memory. And perhaps, somewhere in that silence, something stirred. Because even as her remains were melted down, America was building a new generation of ships, vessels powered not by oil and fire, but by the splitting of atoms. The Navy, it seemed, was entering a new age of light. And in 1961, from the shipyards at Newport News, Virginia, that light took form once again.
She was vast, more city than ship. Her decks stretched longer than 4 football fields. Her hull rose from the water like a modern fortress. She was driven not by diesel or steam, but by 8 nuclear reactors. The air around her shimmered faintly with heat and promise. Her name was USS Enterprise CVN-65. The world called her the Big E once more. At her commissioning, Admiral Arleigh Burke spoke words that carried both reverence and resolve. This ship bears the proudest name in naval history. May she live up to the legend, and may the men who serve aboard her never forget the courage that gave that name its honor. For many of the old CV-6 veterans who attended, it was like seeing an old spirit reborn. Some wept openly as the new carrier's flag was raised, recalling the ghost of their ship gliding silently across the Pacific decades before. Others smiled quietly, knowing that the story had never really ended. The Enterprise name, by then, had become almost mythic, less a word, more a symbol of persistence. The new ship was a marvel of engineering, a floating testament to how far the world had come since the days of wooden decks and propeller planes. Her corridors hummed with electronics. Her hangars glowed under fluorescent lights. Yet amid the futuristic hum of reactors, a trace of the old spirit lingered, like a familiar melody beneath a new song. I once read a letter written by a young sailor serving aboard CVN-65 in the 1960s. He'd never seen the original Big E, yet he wrote as though haunted by her presence. Sometimes, when I'm alone on night watch, I swear I can hear another ship moving beside us. No lights, no sound, just a shadow in the waves. The old-timers say it's the ghost of the first Enterprise keeping watch. The Cold War was a different kind of ocean, quieter on the surface, colder beneath. The battles were of ideology, deterrence, presence. The Enterprise CVN-65 carried jets that broke the sound barrier, bombers that could deliver nuclear payloads across continents. She sailed not into chaos, but into vigilance. Yet even then, her name evoked an era when courage was measured in inches of steel and heartbeats per minute. When she sailed into the Mediterranean, her sleek gray hull gleaming in the morning light, sailors aboard other ships would pause to watch. "There goes the Enterprise," they'd whisper. The name alone was enough to command a moment of awe. And history, ever fond of its circles, brought her back to war. In Vietnam, she launched sorties that thundered over jungles half a world away. Her decks once again became the stage for exhaustion, bravery, and loss. Young pilots, some not yet 20, felt the same mix of fear and duty that their predecessors had known in 1942. One of them, Lieutenant Dale Jenkins, wrote in his diary during a brief lull in operations, "The deck feels the same, I think. The salt smells the same. When I launch into the dark, I like to believe she's watching, the first Enterprise, the ghost ship of the Pacific. Maybe she steadies our wings. Those words strike me deeply, even now. Because the continuity of names in the Navy is not mere tradition, it is memory made tangible. The men who serve aboard ships like Enterprise do not only inherit a vessel, they inherit an entire lineage of courage, sacrifice, and shared spirit. By the late 1970s, the CVN-65 had become a symbol of American presence on the seas, appearing wherever tension rose. Her silhouette was familiar across oceans, from the Persian Gulf to the Indian Ocean. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, she had steamed silently near the blockade line, her planes armed, her crew ready. Yet she never fired a shot. Her very presence was enough. And perhaps that is the greatest evolution of the Big E's legend. The first Enterprise had survived because she fought with relentless endurance. The second endured because she represented something so powerful that fighting often became unnecessary. I once visited her during her final years of service, long after her glory days. Her passageways were narrower than I expected, her air thick with that particular scent of machine oil and metal that never leaves an aircraft carrier. The crew spoke of her with affection, as though she were a living companion. "She's old, but she still hums," one sailor told me with a grin. On a quiet night, standing near the stern, I felt the faint vibration of her reactors beneath my feet, the deep, steady pulse of power. It reminded me, uncannily, of how the men of 1944 had described their ship's heartbeat. Decades apart, same rhythm, same ghost. When she was decommissioned in 2012, it marked the end of an era. Her 8 reactors went silent, her decks, once roaring with jet engines, fell quiet. Yet the name, Enterprise, was already being prepared for another rebirth. The Navy announced that a new ship, CVN-80, would carry the name forward into the 21st century. It was more than continuity, it was resurrection. 3 ships, 1 soul. And if one listens carefully, it feels as though that soul stretches like a long thread across the decades, through Pearl Harbor and Midway, through the Jet Age and the Cold War, through the calm seas of peace and the uneasy waters of deterrence. The Enterprise is more than a ship. She is an idea, a promise that courage, once kindled, never dies. As I write this now, the fire beside me burns low. The room smells faintly of ash and sea salt, perhaps my imagination, perhaps memory. I think of those men, the ones who served aboard both the old and the new. How they found comfort in the sound of engines, in the rhythm of the waves, in the simple act of doing their duty. And I think of the word Enterprise itself. It means, after all, a venture, a bold undertaking. How fitting that it should name a ship that carried humanity's oldest hope, that even in chaos, order and courage might endure. So the legend sailed on, reborn, reshaped, but never diminished. The Big E remained what she had always been, a shadow on the sea, a whisper in the wind, a reminder that endurance is its own kind of grace. And far away, in some quiet corner of the Pacific, perhaps the waves still murmur her name against the hulls of passing ships, as if telling the ocean that the story is not over yet. But legends, like men, do not rest easily. Long after the last Enterprise went dark, the world's oceans still carried her echo, and the memories of those who had lived within her steel heart began to surface, fragile as film reels unspooled in time. Some nights, when the world feels quieter than usual, I like to think the ocean still remembers. The sound of it, slow and endless, is like breathing, not human, not mechanical, but something older. When I listen closely enough, I sometimes imagine I can hear the hum of propellers deep beneath the waves, far away from sight. Perhaps it is only memory, perhaps the ghost of the Enterprise, whispering through time. For those who once lived aboard her, that sound never really left. Even decades after the war, men would wake in the middle of the night, certain they had heard it again, the vibration of engines through steel decks, the muffled clang of a hatch, the gentle creak of the ship turning into the wind. These were not nightmares, not always. They were memories made physical, sounds that had soaked into their bones. The Enterprise had been more than their battlefield, she had been their home. I remember speaking once with Chief Petty Officer Leonard Len Harrison, one of the few surviving crewmen from the Battle of Midway. His hands shook as he held his tea, but his voice, though gravelly, carried the clarity of a man who still sailed every night in his dreams. "You never forget the sound of her waking up," he said. "At dawn, when the deck lights came on and the boilers started humming, it was like hearing the heart of the world start beating again. We were just kids, most of us, but the Big E, she made us feel like giants." Len told me that when the Enterprise had finally gone home after the war, many of the men didn't quite know what to do with themselves. They found work, raised families, lived lives as ordinary as they could. But every once in a while, they'd meet again, a reunion in a town hall, a shared lunch at a veterans club. Someone would always bring a photograph, the ship's silhouette against a rising sun, the deck crew grinning in grease and oil, the white wake stretching behind her like a comet's tail. They'd fall silent for a while, remembering. "She was loud," Len said with a chuckle. "But when she wanted to be quiet, you could hear your heartbeat echo off the bulkheads. You'd think, this ship's listening." And maybe she was. I believed him. Because the Enterprise wasn't just a machine of war, she was a stage for humanity, for all its contradictions. Laughter and terror, exhaustion and joy, all folded into one long voyage. The men aboard her had grown old, but their memories had not. In the archives of the Naval History and Heritage Command, there's a box of letters from Enterprise crewmen dated between 1941 and 1945. Some are smeared with salt, others are written in pencil so faint that you have to tilt the paper to catch the words. One, written by a sailor named Edward Teddy Monroe to his sister, reads, "You wouldn't believe how quiet the ocean can be, sis. At night, we stand on deck and watch the stars, thousands of them. The ship hums below us, steady as breath. Sometimes I think if I let go, she'd keep me afloat forever. It's strange, but you stop feeling alone out here. You start feeling part of something bigger." Teddy never made it home. His name is etched into the memorial at Pearl Harbor, one of many who gave their lives beneath that name, Enterprise. But his letter, fragile and yellowed, carries something eternal, the sense that even amid destruction, there was peace to be found in purpose. As I sat in the archive room reading that line, steady as breath, I found myself staring out the window toward the gray blur of the Potomac River. It struck me that the men of the Enterprise had lived in rhythm with the sea, and that rhythm never really stopped. Even after their deaths, their stories moved like waves, breaking gently on new shores. The Enterprise's legacy today isn't only in steel and photographs. It's in the way her story has been told and retold, generation after generation. In museums, you can find fragments, a section of deck plate, a dented helmet, a tattered flight jacket that smells faintly of oil and salt. But the true relics are the stories told by grandchildren and great-grandchildren. I once met the daughter of a radio operator named Jack Wilkins. She kept a small wooden box in her living room, inside which were her father's war medals and a folded letter marked, "For my family, if I don't come back." She never opened it until the day he passed away. Inside was not a confession of fear or sorrow, but gratitude. "If you're reading this," he wrote, "it means I've had the honor to serve on the finest ship to ever sail. Don't remember me for fighting. Remember that I was part of something that mattered." Those words, simple and unadorned, carried a quiet beauty. They reminded me of something I'd once read in a naval chaplain's journal from the same era. In war, the sea takes what it must, but it always gives back the memory of those who sailed it. That, perhaps, is why the Enterprise endures in our collective imagination. She represents not only strength, but continuity, the unbroken line between those who fought and those who remember. As years passed, the Enterprise became a kind of mythic presence among sailors. New recruits would whisper her name, as though invoking luck. Old captains would quote her history to inspire their crews. Even those who never set foot on her decks felt connected to her, as though she were a lighthouse shining across generations. In 2012, when the Enterprise CVN-65 made her final voyage, thousands of people gathered to watch. Some were veterans of the old Big E, standing with canes and medals pinned to their coats. Others were children who had only seen her in documentaries. But all fell silent as the ship approached port, her deck bare, her flags drawn low. The announcer's voice trembled slightly over the speakers as he said, "Ladies and gentlemen, the United States ship Enterprise, the most storied name in naval history." The ship's horn sounded, long and mournful, echoing off the water like a memory refusing to fade. Some in the crowd wept. Others saluted. For a brief moment, it felt as though the past and present had met upon the waves, as though the ghosts of Midway, Santa Cruz, and Okinawa stood once again upon her deck. Later that night, as the ship lay moored in darkness, a light wind stirred across the harbor. Some say they heard faint music, the Navy hymn, perhaps, carried on the air. I can't say if it's true. But knowing what I do about sailors and the sea, I'd like to believe it. Because the ocean never really forgets. Every ripple carries a whisper of the ships that once cut through it. Every wave holds the rhythm of 1,000 engines now silent. And somewhere, beyond hearing, beyond sight, the Enterprise still sails, in stories, in dreams, in the quiet hum of memory. The name, the legend, the soul, they've all become part of that infinite blue. And as I close my notes for tonight, I think again of Teddy Monroe's letter, steady as breath. Yes, that's what the Enterprise was. A breath held between war and peace, courage and fear, past and future. And perhaps that's why her story still lulls us, even now, not as a tale of battle, but as a lullaby for those who once faced the storm and found calm within it. Yet even legends must find rest. As the Enterprise drifted into memory, new ships took her place, and with them, new sailors who carried her ghost into a changing world, unaware that they were stepping into the wake of history itself. When the Enterprise CVN-65 finally went silent, the world seemed smaller for it. The gray horizon she once commanded felt strangely empty, as though a voice had been removed from the chorus of the sea. But the story did not end there. For even as the ship's lights dimmed, her shadow stretched forward, long and luminous, falling upon the next generation of sailors who would grow up under her legend. They were the sons and grandsons of men who had fought aboard the first Enterprise, though most of them never met those veterans. They had grown up with bedtime stories instead, tales told in cracked voices around kitchen tables, of steel decks and salt wind, of dogfights over the Pacific and the sudden flash of dawn at Midway. The details were blurred by time, softened by memory, yet the feeling remained intact. Pride, reverence, a sense that the name Enterprise meant something vast and unshakable. One such man was Lieutenant Commander Mark Donnelly, who served aboard CVN-65 during the late 1990s. When I met him years later, his hair was gray at the temples and his hands bore the faint scars of long-ago machinery. He smiled when I asked what it felt like to serve on a ship that carried such history. "It was like living inside a legend," he said. "Everywhere you walked, someone had walked before you, men who'd fought at Midway, Santa Cruz, Okinawa. You could almost feel them in the metal. We weren't just serving the Navy, We were serving memory. He paused, then added with quiet reflection. Sometimes I think she had a soul. Not in the mystical sense, maybe, but something lived inside her. You could feel it in the way she moved through the water. Mark wasn't alone in feeling that. Many sailors aboard the nuclear Enterprise spoke of the ship as if she were a living presence, patient, knowing, a little stubborn. Her decks creaked differently from other carriers. Her bulkhead seemed to sigh when the wind rose. And during long nights at sea, when the hum of the reactors filled the silence, there were moments when the crew swore they could hear echoes, faint laughter, distant footsteps, the lingering hum of propellers that hadn't turned since 1945. Superstition, perhaps. But sailors have always lived close to mystery. The spirit of the Big E became more than nostalgia. It was a standard. A myth that shaped behavior, inspired effort, and defined what it meant to belong to something enduring. Young officers were taught her history not as trivia but as scripture. Midway, Santa Cruz, and Okinawa were not just battles, they were parables about duty, ingenuity, and endurance. And so, in a sense, every sailor who walked her deck became one of her sons. But the world they inherited was different. The enemy was no longer a fleet sailing under a rising sun but uncertainty itself, the invisible tensions of the Cold War, the shifting sands of global conflict. War was quieter now, but no less perilous. When Enterprise CVN-65 launched sorties over the Persian Gulf during Operation Desert Fox in 1998, the men and women aboard her felt the weight of legacy more keenly than ever. They were operating the most advanced machines on Earth, yet in their hearts, many still carried images of torpedo bombers and flak clouds over the Pacific. The war had changed, but courage had not. I remember reading a small piece in a naval magazine from that time, written by a pilot who flew from her deck during those operations. He wrote, "The night launches are my favorite. The deck is lit in dim red, the sea is black as ink, and the ship hums below us, steady and sure. When I rolled down the catapult, I always whispered the same thing under my breath, for the Big E. It's habit now. Tradition, I suppose. A salute to the ghosts who flew before." That single phrase, "for the Big E," was still being whispered generations later. I've heard it said by sailors serving aboard the new Gerald R. Ford-class carriers under construction today, one of which will carry the name Enterprise CVN-80. It's remarkable, really, how the spirit of one ship, launched nearly a century ago, continues to ripple outward like waves across time. When I visited the Newport News shipyard a few years ago, the skeleton of CVN-80 stood immense and silent under scaffolding. The workers moved about her with quiet reverence, as if constructing a cathedral. I spoke to one of them, a welder named Carl, who told me, "My grandfather served on CV-6 in the Pacific. He never talked about the war much, but he always said she took care of us. When I found out I'd be working on the new Enterprise, I took it as a sign. Like things had come full circle. And so, with every weld, every bolt, every careful measurement, the legend lives on, shaped by new hands, fueled by the same invisible current of remembrance." What fascinates me most about this continuity is how it bridges not only generations, but identities. The Enterprise's legacy is not just American, it has become, in a quiet way, universal. She represents something beyond national pride, the idea that courage can echo, that sacrifice can outlast its own moment. In naval academies and museums across the world, cadets study her campaigns, not for their tactics alone, but for their humanity. The stories of sailors working through exhaustion, of pilots launching into storms they might not return from, of mechanics repairing decks under fire, these are not just historical facts. They are meditations on resilience. It's strange how history can soften with time, how the sharp edges of battle blur into something almost tender. Today, When I speak to young sailors about the Big E, they don't speak of her weapons or her victories. They speak of her presence. The way she symbolized unity. The way she seemed, even in her silence, to hold together all the contradictions of war, destruction and creation, fear and faith, death and endurance. And I think that's what makes the story of the Enterprise so profoundly human. It isn't just about a ship that fought well, it's about a vessel that gathered meaning far beyond steel and rivets. She became, somehow, a mirror in which men saw the best parts of themselves reflected back. The Enterprise reminds us that heroism does not vanish when the engines go quiet. It lingers, in the minds of those who remember, in the names we give to ships yet unborn, in the quiet pride of those who understand that history is not something we leave behind, but something we continue. When I think of all the sons of the Big E, from the Midway veterans to the young sailors welding her rebirth, I think of a single unbroken line, stretching through time. A chain of hands, each passing forward a small spark of memory. And that spark, small as it is, burns with a light no ocean can drown. Perhaps that is why, when sailors of the modern Navy hear the name Enterprise, they straighten a little taller, speak a little softer. It's not reverence for power. It's reverence for continuity, for the enduring hum of the sea that ties them, however distantly, to those who came before. The Big E's story, then, is not a tale of endings, but of inheritance. Of how courage, once ignited, finds new forms to inhabit. And as I sit here tonight, the sound of the sea faint beyond my window, I find myself whispering the same words that pilots once muttered into the Pacific wind, a quiet invocation that has spanned nearly a century. For the Big E. But the ocean, ever restless, has a way of keeping its own archives. In the depths, where light barely reaches, the remains of 1,000 ships lie dreaming, and among them, whispers of the Big E still drift, waiting to be found by those who listen closely enough to the waves. There is a silence beneath the sea that no surface sound can touch. It is not the silence of absence, but of depth, a stillness so complete that even time seems to slow there. The ocean, vast and ancient, holds everything it has ever been given. Steel and bone, coral and memory, all lie together under its endless blue breath. When divers descend into the Pacific, the world narrows to the sound of their own bubbles. Light fades into soft green, and then gray. And there, in the dim quiet, the past begins to emerge, not as stories in books, but as shadows in the sand, rivets in coral, ghosts in metal. I have not been a diver myself, but I have spent long hours listening to those who are. Marine historians, naval archaeologists, and former sailors who could not bear to stay away from the sea, they speak of the wrecks as though describing sleeping giants. One of them, Dr. Howard Kim, told me over tea in his Seattle office that exploring those ruins feels like entering a cathedral. It's the hush, he said. Even at 200 feet down, you can feel it, the sense that you're intruding on something sacred. The ships down there, they're not just wreckage. They're memorials. Every bolt and plate tells a story of life interrupted. He showed me photographs from a dive site near the Solomons, twisted metal half buried in sand, a propeller encrusted with coral, a porcelain mug still intact after nearly 80 years. This belonged to a sailor, he said softly. Someone who probably had coffee from it before dawn, the morning his ship went under. I stared at the image for a long time. The mug was white, its handle broken, but a faint blue design still curled along the rim. It looked ordinary, almost peaceful. So much of war, I thought, ends up looking peaceful after enough time has passed. The Enterprise herself never sank, of course. She survived her battles, returned home, and was eventually dismantled, her bones scattered into other forms, her spirit carried on in new steel. But the men she fought beside, and against, remain beneath those waters still. The Pacific is a graveyard of ships, and in its quiet depths lie fragments of her story too. Dr. Kim once dived at the site of the USS Yorktown at Midway, the sister ship whose loss had marked one of the war's turning points. He told me that as he floated above her broken hull, he could see where the metal had been peeled open by explosions. Yet, within that ruin, life had returned, coral growing along the gun mounts, small fish darting in and out of the open bridge. "She's alive again," he said. "Not as a ship, but as a reef, as part of the ocean's own memory." That image stayed with me, destruction transformed into creation, history becoming habitat. It seemed fitting that the sea, which had once swallowed so much suffering, would eventually make it beautiful again. There are those who believe the ocean keeps secrets deliberately, that it holds on to the past not out of malice, but out of mercy. The sea erases detail, softens edges, and in time, turns horror into harmony. The bombs are gone, the blood has faded, and all that remains is the slow, steady pulse of tides washing through corridors of rusted steel. Sometimes, divers claim to hear things down there. The faint clang of metal, the distant rumble of engines long silent. One swore he heard music once, a ghostly echo of anchors away, drifting through the currents. Rationally, we know such sounds can be tricks of current and resonance, but part of me wonders if the sea doesn't replay fragments of its own memory when no one's listening. For the sailors who served aboard the Enterprise, the ocean was both enemy and ally, the stage upon which every act of courage was performed, and the great equalizer that humbled even the most powerful fleet. Today, many of their descendants visit the Pacific as tourists or researchers, unaware that beneath their boats lie the remains of history, ships that once burned, men who once dreamed. The waves they splash through have washed over Midway, over the Santa Cruz Islands, over Okinawa, the same waters that reflected the fires of war, now glittering with sunlight. In that shimmering calm, it is easy to forget what sleeps below. But memory, like the tide, always finds its way back to shore. Every few years, naval researchers launch expeditions to map the wrecks of the Pacific War. With sonar and remote vehicles, they trace the outlines of ships long thought lost, the Akagi, the Kaga, the Hornet. When the first images of those wrecks were released, veterans wept quietly in front of glowing screens. The ships were draped in coral, their guns pointing still toward empty horizons. Time had not erased them, it had simply let them rest. Among those who viewed those images was a man named Peter Coulson, whose father had served aboard the Enterprise during the Battle of the Eastern Solomons. When interviewed, Peter said, "Seeing those ships down there, it felt like hearing from my father again. He used to tell me, the ocean never forgets. It just keeps our stories where we can't reach them yet." That line struck me deeply. Because perhaps that's the true legacy of the Enterprise and her generation, not in the ships that remain above the surface, but in the knowledge that remembrance itself is a kind of navigation. We steer through memory the way sailors once steered through storms, by instinct, by faith, by the faintest glimmer of light in the distance. The sea and memory share a strange kinship. Both are fluid, both reflect light differently depending on the hour, and both conceal more than they reveal. When I think of the Big E now, I no longer imagine her roaring into battle with her decks lined with planes. I imagine her as part of that vast underwater silence, a spirit woven through the coral, watching over the rusted remains of her companions. A guardian of all that once was. There's a particular peace in that thought, that after all the chaos, after the fire and the fury, what remains is stillness. The kind of stillness that holds everything together, gently, without judgment. Once, while visiting a naval cemetery in Hawaii, I met an old diver who had worked on wreck surveys for decades. He told me he had stopped taking photographs of the wrecks altogether. "You can't capture what's down there," he said. "Not really. the light's different. The feeling's different. It's not sadness, it's quiet respect. You're standing in someone's last view of the world. And all you can do is be still and listen. I asked him what he thought he was listening for. He smiled faintly and said, "For the sound of the ship breathing. They never really stop." Perhaps that's true. Perhaps, beneath the waves, the Enterprise still hums faintly, not as a machine, but as memory. The sound of courage, of endurance, of life continuing long after the engines have gone cold. The ocean has taken everything that was once noise and turned it into something soft. A lullaby, perhaps, for the restless. And maybe that's why, when we tell these stories, in classrooms, in documentaries, in quiet, sleepy narrations like this one, we are, in our own way, listening back. We are returning to the sea. And she, as always, remembers. But even as the wreck slept beneath the waves, the spirit of the Enterprise refused to rest, finding new life in the words of those who remembered her, in the documentaries that whispered her legend, and in the young who dreamt of her without ever seeing her sails cut across the sea. Long after the guns went silent, the story of the USS Enterprise continued to ripple outward, across generations, across oceans, through the soft static of black and white film and the trembling voices of veterans speaking into microphones for the first time. Stories have a way of surviving even when their sources do not. They drift, like bottles in the sea, carried by those who remember, and sometimes, by those who only wish to. When the Big E returned home after the war, she was greeted not by crowds or fireworks, but by the quiet work of dismantling. Piece by piece, her parts were sold off for scrap. The ship that had once stood as a symbol of defiance against impossible odds, that had outlived every other carrier of her class, now disappeared into yards of rust and rivet, becoming once more just metal. But people did not forget. In the years that followed, her name began to appear in books, newspapers, and war diaries. Sailors who had served aboard her gathered for reunions, men now gray and slow, who once ran across burning decks in the smoke of Midway. They would bring photographs, faded letters, and small mementos. A piece of plating. A cap badge. A strip of deckwood kept in a drawer. One such reunion was held in 1960, in San Diego. A journalist there recorded one of the sailors saying softly, "They scrapped the ship, but not the spirit. You can't scrap something that lived like that." It was true. The Enterprise had already become more than steel. She had become a legend, a story told around kitchen tables, in classrooms, in the hushed reverence of museum halls. Documentaries began to appear, old wartime footage cut together with narration that sounded like thunder over the Pacific. But beyond the footage and statistics, there was something else, the quiet awe of those who spoke her name. The veterans didn't describe her as a ship, they spoke of her as a she, as though the Enterprise had been a living thing, a companion, a home. One sailor, recalling the Battle of Santa Cruz, said, "She took every hit we thought would end her, and still she turned into the wind. You could feel her will. Like she was saying, not yet." There's a strange intimacy in the way humans talk about their machines of war, especially those that saved them. A pilot may love his plane, a soldier may trust his rifle. But sailors form bonds with ships as if they were part of themselves. The Enterprise, more than any other, seemed to have a soul. And so, long after she was gone, her ghost lived on in speech, in memory, and in the stories told to children who had never seen war. One such child was a boy named James Holland, not the historian we know today, but a Kansas farm boy whose father had served aboard the Enterprise in 1942. Every night before bed, his father would tell him stories about Big E. Not the bloody details, not the terror, but the strange beauty of it all, the way the sea looked before dawn, the smell of oil and salt, the sense of being part of something immense. Years later, that boy would say, "I didn't grow up afraid of war. I grew up in awe of courage." Those bedtime stories, told in tired voices under the warm hum of a lamp, became the foundation of an entire culture of remembrance. Through storytelling, trauma became legend. Fear became inspiration. In the 1970s, when the new nuclear carrier USS Enterprise CVN-65 was commissioned, veterans of the original ship were invited to the ceremony. Some cried openly as they watched the sleek gray vessel slide into the sunlight. A new Enterprise, they said, meant the old one would never truly die. When asked what it felt like, one old mechanic said, "It's like seeing your daughter grow up and take her mother's name." The U.S. Navy itself began to treat the Enterprise as something almost mythic, a symbol of endurance. Her name became a legacy, passed down through generations of sailors who never met the men who fought at Midway but still felt they were part of something larger. In a way, that's what legends do. They connect the living to the dead, not through blood, but through meaning. Today, if you visit the Naval Aviation Museum in Pensacola or the Intrepid Museum in New York, you'll find small exhibits dedicated to her, photographs of her deck crew, fragments of her flight log, the names of those who never returned. Children stand before those displays, tracing the outlines of planes with their fingers. They don't yet understand the full story, but they sense the gravity of it, the stillness in the air, the hush of respect that follows her name. Somewhere between fact and reverence, between report and lullaby, the Enterprise has found her afterlife. Her story now lives in the voices of narrators and historians, in the soft-spoken tones of documentaries played late at night, in sleep-friendly retellings where the listener drifts between the world of history and dreams. The roar of engines fades into a gentle hum, the shouts of battle become echoes softened by time. Perhaps that's fitting. Because the Enterprise herself was never just about victory, she was about endurance. About holding on through the storm, no matter how fierce it becomes. And that is a lesson best told softly, like a bedtime story. There's an old recording from the 1950s, a radio documentary called "The Ship That Would Not Die." The narrator's voice, low and steady, recounts the moments when the Enterprise was struck again and again, yet stayed afloat. "She carried her scars as badges," he says, "and her silence as prayer." That line could describe every veteran who served aboard her. Many carried their own scars home, not all visible, but all deep. The years after the war were quiet ones for most of them. Some took to farming, others to teaching, some to wandering. Yet, when they met each other, even decades later, they'd still start every conversation the same way. "Were you on the Biggie?" And with that, time would collapse, the years falling away until they were back on that deck, smelling the sea, feeling the hum beneath their boots. I think there's something profoundly human about that, the way memory preserves not the chaos, but the rhythm. The sense of belonging to something vast, something worth remembering. We live in an age of screens now, where footage can be colored, restored, slowed down, and replayed endlessly. You can find the Enterprise's battles on YouTube, set to music, narrated by modern historians. But even with all our technology, there's something about the quiet retellings, the soft-voiced bedtime versions, that reach deeper. Because when told gently, the story of the Enterprise isn't just about war. It's about endurance in the face of impossible odds. About beauty in destruction. About the strange tenderness that can exist even within the machinery of conflict. Every time her story is told, another light flickers on in that long corridor of history, and the Biggie sails once more, through words instead of waves. Perhaps that's how legends truly live, not in monuments of steel, but in the voices that whisper their names long after the noise has faded. So tonight, as you listen, perhaps in bed, with the lights low and the hum of night surrounding you, remember that once, out there in the dark Pacific, a ship called the Enterprise turned her bow toward the wind and refused to die. And that somewhere, beneath the deep hush of the ocean and the stillness of history, her story continues to sail. As the waves rolled on and generations changed, the Enterprise became more than a ship, more than a name. She became a symbol, a guardian watching over all who cross the sea, a reminder that courage, once lived, never truly sinks. When the Pacific sleeps, it sleeps deeply. The waves rise and fall like the slow breathing of some ancient creature, a heartbeat that has pulsed since long before men learned to fight upon it. If you listen closely, on those rare nights when the world is still, you can almost hear the ghosts of ships whispering beneath the tide. And among them, perhaps, the faintest echo of the Enterprise. She does not rest in one place. The men who served aboard her often said she was alive, and if that's true, then she could not have been content to lie still. She sails in the memory of those who remember her name, in the archives where her logbooks lie, in the eyes of those who study grainy footage of her turning into the wind, proud and unbroken. To speak of her now is to speak of everything that endures. The years since her last voyage have gathered like barnacles on the hull of time. Generations have grown, fought their own wars, and drifted away, and yet the Enterprise endures, reborn in every ship that bears her name. The nuclear carrier that followed her, CVN-65, bore the same proud title. And now, another Enterprise, CVN-80, is being built anew, a carrier for a new age, an echo of that first legend. Each new ship is different, larger, stronger, faster. But in the quiet spaces between the steel plates and circuits, something older hums, an inheritance not of metal, but of memory. That is the eternal watch. It's said that when the wind passes through the rigging of modern carriers, the crew sometimes hears a low, hollow note, like a distant bell. Of course, it's only the sound of the ocean, the physics of cables and the breeze. But still, some whisper that it's the Big E keeping watch, calling her children home across the waves. When I visited Pearl Harbor some years ago, I stood by the docks at sunset. The air smelled of salt and rust. The sea had that strange, quiet color it takes on at dusk, either blue nor gray, but something between. And as the sky turned amber, I thought about all the ships that had come and gone from this place. There's something humbling about standing beside the sea with the names of the dead nearby. You realize that history is not a single story, it's an unending tide, carrying fragments of human will through time. The Enterprise was one fragment among millions. Yet she shone so fiercely that even now, decades later, her light reaches us. Perhaps that is the true measure of legacy, not the steel we build, but the stories we leave behind to guide others through their own storms. One of the last surviving crewmen, interviewed in the early 2000s, said something that stayed with me. "We thought we were fighting to win the war. Maybe we were just fighting so that stories like ours could be told in peace." He was right. Every history, every retelling, every gentle narration that drifts across headphones in the quiet of night, each is a small victory of peace over silence. And so, I tell her story softly. Not to glorify war, but to remember those who faced it. Not to awaken the roar of engines, but to honor the hush that follows. There is a particular stillness that belongs only to the sea at night, a vast, endless dark where the stars seem close enough to touch. Sailors once said that when you were far from shore, the stars became your compass, your comfort, your home. I like to think that somewhere out there, beneath those same stars, the spirit of the Enterprise still patrols, a silent sentinel over the Pacific. Not a ghost of war, but of endurance. Because endurance is quieter than courage, and deeper. It does not shout, or blaze, or demand to be remembered. It simply keeps going, through wind and storm and time itself. Every great ship eventually returns to the sea. Even those that are scrapped and scattered find their way back, piece by piece, through salt, air, and story. The Enterprise, though gone, is everywhere, in the words of historians, the ink of ship registries, the hush of ocean documentaries played in dark rooms to help weary minds drift to sleep. She belongs to the rhythm of the waves now. Sometimes, when I write late into the night, I catch myself pausing at the sound of a passing train, a distant whistle echoing through the quiet streets. For a moment, it sounds like the call of a ship's horn. And I imagine the Enterprise moving through the dark, her decks lit faintly, her crew awake and watchful, her bow cutting through eternity. There is comfort in that image. Because even as the world changes, its weapons more terrible, its wars more distant, there remains something unshakably human in the idea of watchfulness. To stand guard, to endure, to hope for calm seas. The Enterprise stands for that. For the idea that courage can exist without glory, and that even destruction can be tempered by grace. If you close your eyes, perhaps you can picture it, the endless Pacific, calm and silver under moonlight. The wind whispering softly against the waves. And somewhere beyond the horizon, a faint glimmer of light. It is not fire, nor flare, nor the reflection of the sun. It is memory. It is endurance. It is the eternal watch of the USS Enterprise. In the stillness that follows every storm, the world remembers and whispers. A name spoken softly in the dark can carry farther than thunder. Enterprise. She began as steel and steam, but became something else entirely, a story. A reminder that courage does not end when the battle is over, that even broken ships can still sail on through the memory of those who loved them. The sea keeps her secrets well, yet the echoes of the Biggie remain, woven into every tide, every dawn that breaks across the Pacific, every quiet voice that says, "Do you remember?" Tonight, as you listen, know this: history is not only written in books or carved in stone. It drifts in sound, in the soft rise and fall of waves, in the hum of stories that never quite fade. And when the last light flickers across the horizon, and the stars reclaim the sky, somewhere, out there beyond the edge of sight, the Enterprise still turns into the wind. Ever ready. Ever steady. On her eternal watch.